The rumor reached Aelith Sorvin the way most dangerous things did through stable gossip, half swallowed between forkfuls of grain. "They brought one down from the Thorn Crags," said old Bennick, leaning against the partition gate with the careful laziness of a man who had shoveled dragon stalls for 40 years. "War class, full grown, wings torn to rags and a temper that already put 2 handlers in the medical ward." Aelith set the water pail down. "Which bay?" "Quarantine 12, the deep one past the slag trench." Bennick shook his head. "Don't bother. Commander Doran's already marked it for termination review. Says the beast is unsalvageable, won't eat, won't sleep. Nearly took the head off the veterinary assessor this morning. They're just waiting on the kill order paperwork." Through the open stable doors, dawn light cut across the floor in bright slabs. Beyond the stables, the frontier station of Kaelvorn sprawled along the ridgeline, a patchwork of landing platforms, repair bays, and dragon roosts built into the basalt cliffs where the Thorncrags met the valley floor. Kaelvorn was the last outpost before the deep frontier, and everything about it smelled of distance and hard use. Aelith had worked the stables here for 3 years. Before that, the breeding grounds at Sulwyn. Before that, wherever they would take a girl with no family name and hands too rough for anything but animals. She was 26, brown-skinned, lean from work rather than training, and she had never ridden a dragon in her life. No one in the stables had. The last sanctioned rider bond on record was 4,000 years old, preserved in the archives of the dragon sovereignty as a historical curiosity, a relic from an age when humans and dragons had shared the sky. That age had ended in a war no one alive remembered clearly, and the silence between the species had hardened into law. Dragons were sovereign. Humans served at the margin's stable hands, feed crews, veterinary assistants under dragon physician supervision. The dragons tolerated the arrangement. They did not invite closeness. And they did not accept riders, not for 4 millennia. Aelith picked up her pail and walked toward Quarantine 12. She heard the dragon before she saw it. A low, grinding sound that traveled through the stone floor and climbed into her boots, not a growl, not a vocalization. The sound of something in pain that had decided pain was the only thing left to feel. It vibrated in her teeth. The quarantine bay was built for containment. Reinforced walls, drainage channels cut into the basalt, maglock restraints bolted to the floor and ceiling. The overhead lights were industrial bright, washing everything in flat white. Through the observation window, Aelith could see the dragon. He was enormous. Even for a war class, the designation given to dragons who had served in the sovereignty's border patrols, he was built on a scale that made the containment bay look like a closet. His body filled the space from wall to wall, his tail curled against the far corner, his head pressed into the stone near the drainage channel. His scales were the color of scorched iron, dark and matte where they should have been glossy, cracked along the ridges of his spine. His wings, or what was left of them, were folded tight against his flanks, the membrane torn in long, ragged strips that hung like shredded canvas. But it was the eye that stopped her. One amber eye, visible past the angle of his jaw, fixed on the observation window with an intelligence that had nothing to do with the animal assessments filed in his chart. That eye was furious, and beneath the fury, something worse. Exhaustion. Aelith had seen it before, in the old draft dragons that came through Sulwyn after decades of cargo service, the look of a creature that had been used until use was all it knew, and then discarded when the using was done. But those had been domesticated breeds, docile by generation. This was a war-class sovereign dragon, a being whose species had ruled an empire for longer than humans had possessed written language. The exhaustion in that eye was not defeat. It was rage that had nowhere left to go. She checked the handler's log mounted beside the observation window. His name was listed as Drevok, classification war-class sovereign, age estimated between 800 and 1200 years. Origin, Thorncrag Border Garrison, discharged after sustaining catastrophic flight membrane damage during an unauthorized engagement. Beneath the clinical language, someone had written in pen, unmanageable, refuses all contact, recommended for humane termination. Aelith set down her pail and went to find the bay's access panel. The maglock disengaged with a deep clunk that echoed through the corridor. The containment door slid open. The smell hit her first hot metal, dried blood, and the sharp mineral scent that dragons carried in their skin, concentrated here by days of confinement. The grinding sound was louder inside, rattling her ribs. Drevok's head came up. The motion was faster than something that Sai should have been able to move. His neck uncoiled and his head swung toward the door, jaw opening to expose teeth the length of her forearm. The grinding sound became a hiss, then a snarl, and the temperature in the bay climbed 10 degrees as heat vented from the glands along his throat. Aelith stood in the doorway. She did not step back. "I'm not a handler," she said. Her voice was steady, but her hands were shaking against her thighs. "I'm from the stables. I clean bays. I bring water." The snarl held. His pupils contracted to vertical slits, the threat configuration she had been trained to recognize during her first week at Kael'vorn, the one that meant leave now or do not leave at all. She set the water pail on the floor and slid it forward with her foot. Then she sat down in the doorway, cross-legged, her back against the frame. She pulled a rag from her belt and began wiping the dust from a harness buckle she'd been cleaning earlier, a task so mundane, so deliberately ordinary, that even to herself it felt absurd. Sitting on the floor of a quarantine bay, polishing brass, while an 800-year-old war dragon decided whether to kill her. The snarl faded, not to silence, to the grinding sound again, lower now, less aggressive. The eye watched her. She stayed for 20 minutes. She did not approach. She did not speak again. She cleaned the buckle, set it aside, pulled out another, and cleaned that too. When the 20 minutes were up, she stood, retrieved the untouched water pail, and left, the maglock engaged behind her. That night in the narrow bunk she shared with the other stable hands in Barrack C, she lay awake and thought about the eye. Not the threat in it. She had grown up around large animals and learned early that most aggression was a dialect of fear. What stayed with her was the intelligence, the awareness, the way the pupil had tracked her, not the way a predator tracks prey, but the way a person watches someone who has entered the room uninvited and might, just might, be worth the risk of looking at directly. She had worked with injured creatures before. At Sulwyn, they had brought in a cargo hauler dragon with a crushed foreclaw, an animal 3 times her height, half mad with pain, chained to a loading rig because the handling crew could not get close enough to sedate it. Aelith had been 16. She had walked into the enclosure with a bucket of clean water, sat down on the packed dirt floor, and waited. It had taken 4 hours, but the dragon had drunk the water and allowed the veterinary team close enough to set the claw, and Aelith had learned something that no training manual could teach. That patience was not passive. It was the most active thing you could do in the presence of something afraid. She came back the next morning. Same pail, same spot in the doorway. This time she brought a brush not for the dragon but for herself. She sat and worked the tangles out of her braid while Drevok watched from the far corner, his snarl a low, reflexive thing that seemed to cost him energy he did not have. She talked while she brushed. Not to him, to the air, to the room, to the habit of filling silence that she had carried since childhood. She talked about the weather on the ridgeline, about the thermal patterns that made the landing platforms tricky in the afternoons, about the grain shipment that had arrived with half the bag split and the quartermaster's reaction. Small things. The texture of ordinary days. She did not look at the dragon while she talked, but she felt the weight of his attention shift from defensive assessment to something closer to listening. When she stood to leave, the snarl did not resume. The grinding sound was there, but lower, almost subaudible, and the water pail which she had set inside the door had been moved. Not far, perhaps 2 feet, nudged closer to the center of the bay where the drainage channel could catch any spill. A practical adjustment. The kind of thing a thinking creature does when it has decided that the object is not a threat and might be useful. On the third morning, the pail was empty when she arrived. She refilled it without comment and sat down. Drevok's head was resting on his forelimbs, the torn wings draped across the bay floor like discarded sails. The snarl was gone. In its place, the grinding sound, but softer, less a statement than a habit. "They want to put you down," she said, not looking at him. She was restitching a split seam on her work glove, her needle moving in small, precise strokes. "The paperwork is sitting on Commander Doran's desk. She'll sign it by the end of the week, unless something changes." The amber eye tracked her needle. "I don't know what happened to you in the thorn crags. I don't know what the unauthorized engagement was. I know what torn wings look like, and I know what that sound you make means because I've heard it from every broken animal that's come through these stables." She knotted the thread and bit it off. "You're not broken. You're angry. There's a difference, but nobody here is paying attention to which one it is." Drevok exhaled. The breath was warm, not the scalding heat of the first day, but a steady warmth that stirred the dust on the bay floor. His jaw settled deeper against his forelimbs. The grinding sound stopped. The silence lasted a full minute. Then, from deep in his throat, a sound Aelith had never heard before. Not a growl, not a snarl, not the threat hiss of a dragon defending its space. A single, low tone that resonated in the stone beneath her and pressed against her sternum like a palm. It carried no language she knew, but its meaning was plain enough to anyone who had spent their life around creatures that could not speak. "Stay." She stayed. Word traveled the way it always did in a frontier station, through side glances and meal-line whispers. By the fourth day, the veterinary staff knew that the stable girl was visiting the condemned dragon. By the fifth day, Commander Doran knew. "You opened the containment door," Doran said. She was standing at the entrance to the main stable block, arms crossed, her officer's coat buttoned to the throat despite the valley heat. Doran was career military, transferred to Kaelvorn after 20 years of garrison command in the interior. She was not cruel. She was efficient, which in certain contexts achieved the same result. "Yes, Commander." The same dragon that hospitalized 2 trained handlers. Trained handlers approached him with restraint poles and sedation rigs. "I brought a bucket of water and sat on the floor." Doran studied her. "You understand that if that animal kills you, the liability falls on the station." "He didn't kill me." "He hasn't killed you yet." "The termination order." "Give me a week." The silence between them had the particular weight of a senior officer recalculating. Doran looked toward Quarantine 12, then back at Aelith. "You have 5 days. If he's still refusing handler contact by then, I sign the order." The 5-day clock changed nothing about how Aelith worked. She went to Quarantine 12 at dawn, the same as before. She sat in the doorway, she talked, she brought the pail. What changed was Drevok. On the 4th morning, he moved. Not the defensive head snap of the first encounter, a slow, deliberate shift of his body, turning so that his injured wing was angled toward the doorway where Aelith sat. The torn membrane lay across the stone, the gray edges of infection visible even from 15 feet away. He did not look at her while he did it. He looked at the far wall, as though the positioning were coincidental, as though 800 years of sovereign pride could not permit the admission that he was showing her where it hurt. Aelith looked at the wing, she looked at the gray edges, she said nothing. On the 5th morning, she found the pail moved again, this time positioned directly beside where she usually sat, as though someone had decided that the person who came every day should not have to carry it so far. The drainage grate nearby was damp. He had been drinking then, but also rinsing the bay floor, keeping his space clean, not the behavior of a creature beyond reach. the behavior of one who had decided that the next person through the door deserved a better first impression. She sat and told him about Selwyn, about the cargo hauler with the crushed claw, about the 16-year-old girl who had sat on a dirt floor for 4 hours because nobody else would. "I don't know why I do this," she said. "I don't have a theory about it. I just know that when something is hurt and everyone else is standing at a safe distance writing reports about it, somebody has to sit down." The grinding sound had stopped entirely. The bay was quiet except for his breathing and the distant clatter of the station above them. On the 5th afternoon, the crisis that nearly ended everything arrived without warning. Aelith was in the regular stables, mucking the roost bays on the upper platform, when she heard the alarm, the deep, cyclic klaxon that meant containment breach. She dropped the rake and ran down the access ramp across the maintenance corridor through the slag trench to Quarantine 12. The maglock was engaged. The alarm was coming from inside. Through the observation window she could see what had happened. The veterinary team, 2 technicians in protective gear, a handler with a sedation rig, had entered the bay. They had orders, presumably from someone above Doran's pay grade, to conduct a physical assessment and prepare the dragon for transfer. Standard protocol. Restraint first. Sedate, examine, document, decide. Drivak was pressed against the far wall. His jaw was open, heat pouring from his throat in visible waves that warped the air. The snarl was back, not the low, reflexive thing he had used when Aelith first visited, but the full threat display. Wings spread despite the pain it cost him, neck arched, the bioluminescent glands along his throat pulsing red. The handler's sedation pole was bent at a right angle on the floor. One technician was backed against the wall, her hands up. The other was on the ground, clutching his arm. Aelith hit the comm panel, opened the door. The control officer's voice, tight with alarm. "The bay is in lockdown. Containment protocol. Open the door or he's going to fire, and you'll lose the entire wing of the station." A pause, the maglock disengaged. She walked in. The heat was immediate, a dry, searing wall that pressed against her skin and made her eyes water. The snarl was so loud it obliterated thought, a sustained frequency that vibrated in her skull. "Out," she said to the veterinary team. Her voice was calm, her legs were not. "All 3 of you now." They moved. The uninjured technician hauled her colleague to his feet and they shuffled toward the door, keeping their backs to the wall. The handler retrieved his bent sedation pole and followed. None of them looked at Aelith. They looked at the dragon. The door closed behind them. The bay fell quiet except for the snarl and the hiss of heat. Aelith stood in the center of the room and waited. She did not approach. She did not reach out. She stood and let him see her, just her, no equipment, no restraints, no protective gear. The same person who had been sitting in his doorway every morning for 5 days. The snarl weakened, dropped in pitch. The heat withdrew, the threat glands dimming from red to amber to dark. Drivak's wings folded slowly, the motion causing a visible shudder of pain that ran the length of his body. His head lowered. The grinding sound came back, the one that meant pain, but now it carried something else underneath, a tremor, a raggedness that Aelith recognized from the cargo hauler at Selwyn, from the injured draft dragons at the breeding grounds, from every creature she had ever held together long enough for the fear to pass. He was shaking. She crossed the bay and placed both hands on his jaw. The scales were hot but not burning. The shaking ran through her arms, through her shoulders, into her chest. She pressed her forehead against the ridge above his eye and stayed there. "I know," she said. "They shouldn't have done that. I'm sorry." The shaking slowed. The grinding sound softened. His eye closed. They stayed like that for a long time. When she finally left the bay, Commander Doran was waiting in the corridor. Doran's face was the color of old paper. "The veterinary team acted on a directive from Sector Command," Doran said. Her voice was carefully controlled. "I was not informed in advance. They nearly got killed. and they nearly made him into everything his file says he is. Doran looked through the observation window. Drevok was lying on his side, his breathing slow, his wings folded against his body. He looked like an exhausted animal, which was exactly what he was. "I'll make sure it doesn't happen again," Doran said. "Give me the 5 days you promised." "You have them." On the 6th morning, Aelith brought the water pail and a jar of wound salve she had mixed in the stable pharmacy, the same compound used on draft dragon hide splits, scaled up in concentration and thinned with oil to make it spreadable. She set both inside the bay door and sat. Drevok's head was up, not the defensive snap of the crisis, not the slow lift of the early mornings, something between, watchful. He tracked her as she entered, and when the door closed behind her, the grinding sound that had resumed after the veterinary incident dropped away entirely. His eyes tracked the jar. "Your wing membranes are infected," she said. "I can see it from here. The edges are going gray, which means the tissue is dying back. If it keeps going, you'll lose the membrane to the shoulder joint and they won't be able to save the wing at all, even with surgical intervention." She uncapped the jar. "This will sting, and I have to touch you to apply it, so this is your call." The amber eyes held her. The pupils were not slitted, not the round softness she had seen in gentle breeds, but something between. Assessment. The same look she imagined a general would give a new recruit who had just said something either very brave or very stupid. Drevok lowered his head to the floor and extended his left wing. The membrane unfurled slowly, the motion clearly painful, the torn edges trembling until the damaged section lay spread across the stone. Aelith crossed the bay, 12 steps, each one louder than it should have been. She knelt beside the wing and dipped her hand into the salve. The first touch made him flinch, a full-body shudder that rattled the maglock housings and sent a vibration through the floor. She held still, her salve-covered hand resting on the membrane, and waited. The flinch passed, the membrane settled. She began to work. The salve went on in slow, careful strokes, following the grain of the membrane tissue, pressing gently into the edges of each tear where infection had turned the flesh from dark red to gray. It was methodical work, the kind she had done 1,000 times on smaller creatures' irrigation, cleaning, treating, repeating. Her hands moved with the focused patience of someone who had learned that healing was not a single moment, but a series of small, unglamorous actions repeated, until the body remembered what it was supposed to do. Drevok made no sound, but his breathing changed. The harsh, uneven rhythm of pain shifted to something deeper, slower. His head, which had been raised to watch her, lowered inch by inch until his jaw rested on the stone. His eyes closed. Trust, or something close enough that the distinction did not matter. Aelith worked for an hour. When she finished, the salve had covered every torn edge, every infected margin, every cracked scale along the wing's leading edge. Her hands were stained dark with the compound, her knees ached from the stone, and her back had locked into a knot between her shoulder blades. She sat back on her heels. "Same time tomorrow." One amber eye opened, the pupil was round. She would later learn what that meant: the recognition dilation, the oldest expression in the draconic physiological catalog, reserved for kin, for bonded, for the word that Aelith did not yet know existed. In that moment, she knew only that the dragon who had been scheduled to die was looking at her, as though she were the first thing in a very long time that was not trying to hurt him. She came back every day. The salve in the morning, water at midday, a second treatment at dusk. On the 8th day, she brought a curry brush, the heavy-bristled kind used for post-molt scale maintenance, and began working the dead skin from the ridge of his spine. Drevok's reaction was a sound she had never heard from any dragon, a deep, rumbling harmonic that vibrated the tools on their hooks and made the water in the pail ripple. The veterinary files had no classification for it. The stable hands called it purring. On the 10th day, The first sign appeared that the wings were healing. New membrane tissue, thin, translucent, threaded with dark veins, was growing along the edges of the tears. The veterinary assessor, a different one, not the technician from the crisis, observed the regrowth through the window and calmed Aelith. "That rate of regeneration is not in any of our models," she said. Her name was Tessely, and she was the station's senior dragon medicine specialist. Unlike the handler team that had forced their way in, Tessely had watched the camera footage and concluded that the most scientifically productive thing she could do was stay outside the bay and ask questions through the comm. Sovereign-class membrane tissue typically regenerates at 0.3 centimeters per day under optimal conditions. His is growing at nearly 2 centimeters. The only documented cases of accelerated healing in sovereign dragons are associated with, she paused, with bond-state biochemistry, which is a theoretical field because there haven't been any bond-state dragons to study in 4,000 years. "What does bond-state mean?" Aelith asked. She was sitting on the bay floor, rewrapping the salve jar's lid, which had cracked from the heat. "It means his body is healing faster because of you. Specifically, because of the bond-class neurochemical cascade that his system is producing in response to sustained proximity to a bonded partner." Another pause. "It's in the old texts. The dragons who had riders healed from injuries that should have killed them. The texts attributed it to, I'm translating loosely, the body choosing to survive, because it had something to survive for." Aelith looked at Drevok. He was watching her with the round pupil expression that she had come to think of as his quiet face. Not the threat, not the assessment, not the grinding pain, just presence, attention, the steady, warm regard of a creature who had decided that the person in front of him was worth watching. "Do you hear that?" she asked him. "You're healing faster because I'm here." The harmonic rumbled. Whether it was agreement, amusement, or simply the sound he made when she talked to him, Aelith did not know. She went back to wrapping the jar. Drevok tested the new membrane once, a slow extension that made the bay feel suddenly too small. The wing spread nearly wall to wall, and for a moment Aelith saw him as he must have been before the Thorncrags, 800 years of sovereign grace compressed into a body built for the sky. He folded the wing. His eye found hers, and the rumbling harmonic deepened, shifted, became something that Aelith felt not in her ears but in her chest, behind her sternum, in the place where the body stores the things it knows before the mind catches up. "Partner." She did not tell Commander Doran. She did not tell anyone. The word or the feeling, because it was not truly a word, settled into her like a stone dropped into deep water, and she carried it with her through the rest of the day's chores without knowing what to do with it. The kill order deadline passed without signature. Doran had watched the bay cameras and seen enough to hold her pen, but the commander's patience was not the same as permission, and Aelith knew the margin she was working in was measured in days. On the 9th day, something happened that the veterinary cameras recorded, but that no one on the station fully understood until much later. Aelith had fallen asleep. The evening treatment had run long 2 hours of careful work on the secondary tiers along the right wing's trailing edge, the ones that were deeper and more resistant to the salve. She had been awake since before dawn, had worked a full shift in the regular stables before coming to Quarantine 12, and the warmth of the bay Drevok's body heat, radiating off his scales like a banked furnace, had done what warmth does to tired bodies. She had leaned back against the base of his foreleg, closed her eyes to rest them for a moment, and slipped under. The camera footage, which Commander Doran would review the following morning with an expression that cycled through alarm, disbelief, and something she would never admit was moved, showed the following sequence. Aelith's head tilting against the dragon's foreleg, her breathing evening out, Drevok's head turning slowly to look at her. Then, with a precision that should have been impossible for a creature his size, he curved his neck around until his jaw rested on the stone beside her, close enough that his breath stirred her hair, and he positioned his uninjured wing, the right one, the one that still held most of its membrane, so that it extended over her like a canopy, shielding her from the overhead lights, keeping the warmth in. He held that position for 2 hours and 14 minutes, until Alith woke, looked up at the wing above her, looked at the amber eye watching her from 6 inches away, and said, "How long was I out?" The eye blinked once slowly. With what the veterinary staff's incident report would later describe, in a rare lapse of clinical language, as apparent amusement. Alith sat up, stretched, and reached for her salve jar. "Let's do the left wing again. You were favoring it during extension." She did not mention the wing canopy. She did not need to. Some things are understood better in the doing than the naming. The other stable hands noticed, of course. Jell, who worked the roost platforms and had 20 years' experience with the station's domesticated breeds, started finding excuses to walk past Quarantine 12. He never went inside. But he would stop at the observation window, watch for a few minutes, and then walk away shaking his head, not in disapproval, but in the particular bewilderment of a professional encountering something outside his categories. "That's not taming," he told Alith one evening in the mess hall, pointing his fork at her across the table. "I've tamed over 200 dragons in my career. What's happening in that bay is not taming." "What is it then?" He chewed slowly, looking at his plate. "I don't know. It looks like friendship. But I don't have a word for friendship between a stable hand and a war-class sovereign, because it's not supposed to be possible." "Maybe the word doesn't matter," Alith said. "The sovereignty might disagree." On the 12th morning, the complication arrived. A delegation from the dragon sovereignty landed at Kaelvorn without advance notice. 3 sovereign dragons in full ceremonial regalia, their scales polished to a mirror sheen, their wingspans shadowing the landing platforms as they descended. They were escorted by a retinue of dragonkin officials in formal robes, their horned crests high and sharp, their bearing the particular stiffness of people who had come to deliver bad news and were irritated at having to travel to do it. The lead dragon was named Veilthorn, and he was old enough that his scales had gone from deep blue to the color of winter storms. He was also, as Alith learned from the frantic whispers in the stable block, the regional sovereign commander of the Thorncrag border garrison, Drevok's commanding officer. "The war class in your quarantine bay," Veilthorn said to Commander Doran, his voice carrying the bass resonance of a cathedral organ, "is a deserter. He abandoned his garrison post during an engagement and fled into the deep crags. He was recovered by a retrieval team after 17 days. The sovereignty does not tolerate desertion." Doran stood very straight. "With respect, Sovereign Commander, the animal, the dragon, was delivered to us in critical condition. Our veterinary staff is not relevant. The sovereignty claims jurisdiction over its own. We are here to retrieve the asset and carry out sentencing." "Asset?" Alith heard the word from the back of the crowd that had gathered in the station's main hall, and it landed in her chest like a closed fist. She did not think about what she did next. Later, she would realize that thinking was precisely what she had not done, and that the absence of thought was the only reason it worked. She walked through the crowd, past the dragonkin officials in their formal robes, past the station staff pressed against the walls, past Commander Doran's rigid back and Veilthorn's enormous head, lowered to address the humans at something approaching their eye level. "He's not a deserter," Alith said. The hall went silent. Not the gradual fade of interrupted conversation, but the sharp, sudden silence of a room full of people who have just heard someone say something that should not have been said. Veilthorn's head swung toward her, his eyes deep amber, ancient, carrying the authority of a being who had commanded border garrisons before Alith's species had discovered agriculture, fixed on her with an intensity that made the air feel thinner. "And you are?" Stable hand, Bay maintenance, feed rotation, waste management. Her voice was steady. Her hands at her sides were not. I've been treating his injuries for 12 days. His wing membranes were torn to the shoulder joint, and the infection had gone deep enough to reach the muscle. No animal with that kind of damage flees by choice. He was wounded and he went aground because that's what wounded things do. That's not desertion. That's survival. The silence held. Valethorn's pupils contracted, widened, contracted again, a flicker of expression that Aelith could not read, but that the Dragonkin officials clearly could, because two of them exchanged a glance. You treated a sovereign war-class dragon, Valethorn said. A stable hand. Without veterinary authorization, without handler certification, without, as I understand it, any protocol whatsoever. He wouldn't let anyone with protocols near him. He let me near him because I sat on the floor and gave him water. That's not complicated. That's just what you do when something is hurt and scared. He is not scared. He is a sovereign war dragon of the Thorncrag garrison, 800 years of. 800 years, Aelith said. 800 years of service. How many of those years did anyone sit with him, not command him, not deploy him, not restrain him and examine him and file reports about him, sit with him, talk to him, ask him how he was doing? The hall was very quiet. Valethorn's jaw had closed. He purrs when I brush his scales. He lowers his wings so I can reach the tears. He drank from a bucket I slid across the floor because it was the first time in days anyone offered him something instead of pointing a restraint pole at him. She paused. You can call him whatever the sovereignty's records say he is. But I've been in that bay every morning for almost 2 weeks, and the dragon I know is not a deserter or an asset. He's hurt, and he's been alone, and he's tired of being treated like a problem someone needs to solve. Valethorn was very still. Behind him, the two other sovereign dragons, massive, polished, silent, had shifted their heads to watch Aelith with an attention that felt less like assessment and more like something she could not name. Show me, Valethorn said. She led them to Quarantine 12. The entire delegation, the station staff, Commander Doran, all of them trailing behind a stable hand in a stained work tunic, who walked with the particular stride of someone who knows exactly where they are going and has no time for ceremony. When she opened the containment door, Drevok's head came up. His eyes swept the crowd behind her, the sovereign dragons, the officials, the uniforms, and his jaw opened. The snarl started low, building toward the heat vent, the threat configuration, the full display that had hospitalized 2 handlers and terrified every professional who had attempted contact. Aelith walked in, past the snarl, past the heat. She crossed the bay to where Drevok's head was raised, his neck coiled to strike, his torn wings half spread in the aggressive posture that the handler's manual classified as Stage 4 threat display, the last stage before fire. She put her hand on his jaw. The snarl stopped. It did not fade, it stopped like a switch thrown. The heat dropped. The wings folded. Drevok's head lowered until his chin rested against her palm, the enormous weight of it settling with a gentleness that made the containment bay feel, for a moment, like something else entirely. His eye found hers, round pupil. The rumbling harmonic started in his chest and filled the bay, filled the corridor, filled the silence of every watching dragon and dragonkin and human who stood in the doorway and saw what was happening. Aelith scratched the ridge above his eye. You're all right, she said. I'm here. Valethorn had not moved from the doorway. His pupils were dilated, not the threat slit or the neutral mid-range, but fully round. The recognition dilation. The expression that sovereign dragons reserved for something sacred. Behind him, the 2 escort dragons lowered their heads. Not a bow, something older, something that preceded formality. An acknowledgement carried in the body before the mind could dress it in protocol. One of the Dragonkin officials stepped forward, her crest trembling. She was speaking rapidly to a colleague in formal Draconic, a language Aelith did not understand but whose tone she could read. The official was not alarmed. She was awed. Valethorn spoke. His voice was different now, stripped of the command register, reduced to something rawer. How long since the last bond? Sovereign Commander, Commander Doran asked from behind him. The Rider bond, the true bond, not the domesticated imitation. How long has it been since a dragon of the sovereign class accepted a human partner? Doran checked her data slate, then checked it again. 4,112 years, Sovereign Commander, the bond of Ureth Val during the Third Reconciliation. It is considered apocryphal by most historians. It is not apocryphal. Valethorn's gaze had not left Aelith and Drevok. The stable hand was still standing with her palm on the dragon's jaw, her thumb tracing the ridge of a cracked scale, while an 800-year-old war dragon rumbled against her touch like a hearth fire. It is simply the last recorded instance of something that was not supposed to happen again. Sovereign Commander, what are you saying? I am saying that I came here to retrieve a deserter, and instead I am watching a stable hand hold a rider bond with a sovereign war dragon in a quarantine bay. I am saying that the sentencing order I carry is no longer applicable, because you cannot sentence a bonded dragon without sentencing the rider, and you cannot sentence a rider who has committed no crime. His voice cracked, just slightly, on the last word. I am saying that the sovereignty's position on human-dragon bonds may require reconsideration. Behind Valethorn, one of the Dragonkin officials, the one with the trembling crest, spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. Sovereign Commander, the last bondholder was Ureth Val. She was a blacksmith. She worked iron. She had no rank, no title, no lineage. The histories record that when the sovereignty asked her why the dragon had chosen her, she said the official consulted her data slate, then stopped, because she did not need to consult it. She had memorized the line decades ago in an academy classroom as a footnote in a history that most of her professors had dismissed as myth. She said, I did not choose him, I just did not leave. The silence in the doorway was the kind that changes things, not the dramatic silence of a revelation, the careful silence of people who are recalculating the shape of their world. Aelith did not hear most of it. She was listening to the harmonic in Drevok's chest, feeling it resonate in the bones of her hand, and understanding not intellectually, not through briefings or files or historical records, but in the way the body understands gravity, that the sound was not just for her. It was a declaration, broadcast on a frequency that every dragon in the room could hear. Mine and I am hers. Valethorn stepped into the bay. Drevok's eye tracked him, but the snarl did not return. The old sovereign dragon crossed the stone floor and lowered his enormous head slowly, with the measured dignity of a being who had not bowed in 4 centuries, until his crest was level with Aelith's shoulder. Human, he said. Aelith, she said. My name is Aelith. Aelith? The word settled into his voice like a stone finding its place in a riverbed. What you have done, what you are doing, is not small. You understand this. I understand that he needed help, and nobody was helping him. That is precisely what I mean. He held position for a moment longer, his vast, storm-colored head inches from the human woman who had walked into a quarantine bay with a bucket and refused to leave. Then he straightened. Commander Doran. Sovereign Commander. The termination order is withdrawn. The desertion charge is suspended pending bond review by the Sovereignty Council. This dragon is to be reclassified from detained asset to bonded sovereign, status pending, with this human registered as provisional rider. Doran's mouth opened, closed, opened again. She's a stable hand. Yes, Valethorn said, she is. He turned back to the bay. Drevok was watching him, the old commander, the authority who had signed his deployment orders and his garrison assignments for centuries. The amber eye held no deference, no submission, no recognition of rank, but neither was there hatred, and Veilthorn seemed to understand the significance of that absence, because his next words were not addressed to Doran or to the officials or to any record. They were addressed to Drevok. "I failed you," Veilthorn said. His voice was low. The bass resonance had gone from it, leaving only the sound of a very old being speaking a truth he had carried for longer than he wanted to admit. "You served 800 years. I never once asked what it cost you. No one did." Drevok's eye held the old commander's for a long time. Then slowly the dragon's jaw shifted away from Aelith's hand toward Veilthorn. Not all the way, an inch, two, an opening. Not forgiveness Aelith could feel through the harmonic still pressing against her hand. That forgiveness was not yet possible and might never be. But acknowledgement. The recognition that the words had been spoken and that speaking them was not nothing. Veilthorn held the look for 3 breaths. Then he straightened and walked out. The word moved outward from Kael'vorn the way the rumor had moved inward through whispers, through side-channel transmissions, through the quiet networks that connected frontier stations to interior garrisons to the halls of the sovereignty itself. A rider bond, a true bond, after 4,000 years. Aelith did not pay much attention to any of it. She was in Quarantine 12, applying the morning salve to the left wing's trailing edge, listening to the harmonic that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. But the station changed around her. Subtly at first, the veterinary team stopped referring to Drevok as the quarantine animal and started using his name. The mess hall conversations, which had ranged from skeptical to openly hostile in the early days, the stable girl's going to get herself killed, and then we'll all be filling out incident reports until the next rotation, shifted to something more careful, more curious. Gel, the roost platform handler, began leaving treats outside the quarantine bay, fire-charred bone strips, the kind used for dental maintenance in the domesticated breeds, placed on the floor without comment. Drevok ignored them for 2 days, then ate them on the 3rd. Gel did not say anything about it, but he started leaving them every morning. Commander Doran requisitioned an expanded medical supply kit for the stable pharmacy. The requisition form listed the requesting party as Bay Maintenance Staff, Stable Division. Doran signed it herself. Tessely, the veterinary specialist, began leaving research notes in Aelith's locker, printouts from the old Sovereignty medical archives, texts on sovereign-class membrane structure, and healing protocols that had been written 4,000 years ago and never updated because there had been no need. She highlighted the relevant sections in yellow and added annotations in her precise handwriting. This compound might work better than what you're mixing, ingredients available in the pharmacy's back stock. And note the angle of application along the secondary membranes. The old texts recommend perpendicular strokes rather than parallel, and on one page simply, "You're doing this right. Keep going." Aelith read every note. She adjusted her technique. The wings healed faster. The wing treatments continued twice daily. New membrane was growing faster now. Drevok's body seemed to be healing at a rate that the veterinary staff could not explain, as though the physical damage had been sustained by something deeper than tissue and was now being repaired from the inside out. On the 14th day, Aelith walked him out of Quarantine 12 for the first time. The stable hands stopped working. The veterinary staff stopped monitoring. Even the dragons roosting on the upper platforms went still. Drevok stood in the morning light of Kael'vorn's main courtyard, his scorched iron scales catching the sun, his wings still torn, still healing, but held with a new tension that spoke of intention rather than damage extended to their full span. He was enormous. In the open air, freed from the compression of the containment bay, his scale was almost incomprehensible, a living monument of dark iron and amber fire, his shadow covering half the courtyard. Aelith stood beside him. She came up to the bottom of his shoulder joint. She was holding a curry brush. He lowered his head to her. She brushed the ridge above his eye, the spot he liked, the one that made the harmonic deepen until she could feel it in her feet, and he exhaled. A warm breath that stirred the dust of the courtyard and carried the scent of clean scales and deep fire, and something that smelled, to Aelith, like the sky she had never touched. The Dragonkin officials who had remained at Kaelvorn after Veilthorn's departure watched from the observation balcony. One of them, the young official whose crest had trembled in the quarantine corridor, was recording the scene on her data slate. She would later submit it to the Sovereignty Archives under the classification Bond Documentation, Provisional Entry 1. The entry would remain the most accessed file in the Sovereignty's archive system for the next 300 years. On the 15th day, Drevok did something that changed the veterinary staff's understanding of sovereign-class dragon behavior. Aelith was outside the bay, filling the water pail at the corridor pump, when she heard a sound from inside, not the harmonic, not the grinding, but a sharp, percussive crack. She dropped the pail and ran. Drevok was standing. Not the low, careful posture he had maintained during the healing weeks, standing at full height, his head nearly touching the bay's ceiling, his forelimbs braced apart, his tail coiled for balance. His wings were extended to their maximum span, pressing against the walls. The new membrane tissue stretched between the old framework of bone and cartilage, translucent in the industrial light, threaded with dark veins and the faint iridescence of healthy scale oil. He was testing them, not the tentative flexes he had allowed during the treatments, a full extension, followed by a slow, powerful downbeat that compressed the air in the bay hard enough to pop Aelith's ears. The crack she had heard was the sound of a wing membrane reaching its full tension for the first time in months. She watched from the doorway. She did not enter. This was not about her. This was about him, an 800-year-old war dragon remembering that his wings could hold air, remembering that his body was not just a vessel for pain, remembering the thing that sovereign dragons were built for. The second downbeat sent a ripple of dust across the bay floor. The third made the maglock housings rattle. The fourth was clean, smooth, powerful, the stroke of a wing that had decided it was no longer broken. Drevok folded his wings and looked at Aelith. The amber eyes carried something she had not seen before. Not the gratitude of the early days, not the trust that had built through the treatments, not the warm regard of the harmonic. This was something fiercer. Something that had been buried under pain and confinement, and the grinding acceptance of a creature who had been told he was finished, and was now discovering that the people who had told him that were wrong. Pride. She picked up the water pail. Looked good. Your left trailing edge is still a fraction slow on the upstroke. We'll work on that. The harmonic rumbled. Whether it was agreement or the draconic equivalent of an eye roll, she did not ask. On the 16th day, Aelith discovered that Drevok could speak. She was applying the evening treatment to his left wing when a vibration passed through the membrane under her hands, not the rumbling harmonic she had grown accustomed to, but something structured, patterned, a sequence of tones that repeated twice and then waited. She sat back. Was that a word? The sequence repeated, 3 tones rising. I don't speak Draconic. A pause, then a single tone lower, drawn out. It settled into her chest the way the harmonic did, but this time it carried something specific. Not an emotion, a shape. A visual impression pressed into her awareness the way a seal presses into wax. A wide sky, an open thermal, 2 silhouettes climbing. Flying. You want to fly, she said. The amber eye was round. The harmonic surged. Your wings aren't ready. Another image, the same sky but closer to the ground. A short distance, a test. How far is short? An impression of height, perhaps 200 meters. Aelith looked at the wings. The new membrane was still thin, still fragile, still threaded with healing veins. A hard thermal would tear it. A bad landing would set the recovery back weeks. She looked at his eye. Tomorrow, she said, at dawn, before anyone is up to stop us. They went at dawn. The courtyard was empty except for the night shift stable hand. A young man named Chorus who was sweeping the landing platform when Aelith led Drevok out through the main bay doors. Chorus stopped sweeping. He looked at the dragon, the scorched iron scales catching the first gray light, the wings held at half extension, the amber eyes fixed on the sky with an intensity that made the air feel charged. He looked at Aelith, who was wearing her stained work tunic and carrying nothing except the curry brush clipped to her belt, walking beside a creature that could have leveled the station with a single breath. "Should I?" Chorus started. "Don't call anyone," Aelith said, "and don't look worried, he'll pick up on it." Chorus set down his broom. "I'm not worried. He searched for the word. I don't know what I am. I think I'm watching something that's going to be in the history books. It's just a short flight. We'll be back before breakfast." Chorus nodded. He did not pick up his broom. He stood at the edge of the platform and watched as Aelith and Drevok walked to the overlook, and he would later tell every person he knew, and quite a few he didn't, that the expression on the dragon's face was the closest thing he had ever seen to joy. Aelith stood beside Drevok at the edge of the landing platform, looking down at the valley floor 300 meters below, and felt the precise blend of terror and certainty that precedes every irrevocable decision. "I have no idea how to do this," she said. Drevok lowered his shoulder, not a command, an invitation. His foreleg bent, creating a step in the crook of his elbow, and his neck curved around to watch her with an eye that said, "I know. Come anyway." She climbed. The scales were warm under her hands, rougher than she expected, each one the size of a dinner plate. She found the natural seat between his shoulder blades, a shallow dip where the spine dipped before rising to the base of his neck, and settled into it. There was nothing to hold. No saddle, no harness, no equipment of any kind. Just the warmth of his body beneath her and the vibration of his breathing. "I trust you," she said. It was not a brave statement. It was an accounting of fact. Drevok spread his wings. The new membrane caught the first light of sunrise, thin, luminous, shot through with dark veins that pulsed with his heartbeat. The wind from the valley rose to meet them, and Aelith felt the muscles beneath her shift, gathering. He did not leap. He stepped off the edge and let the thermal take them. The world dropped away, not with violence, not with speed, with a slow, enormous grace that rewrote Aelith's understanding of what motion could be. The valley opened below them, green and gold in the early light. The cliffs of the thorn crags rose on either side, their basalt faces catching the sun. The air was cold and clean and tasted of altitude. Drevok climbed, 200 meters, then 3, then 4. His wings, those torn, healing, impossible wings, found the thermal and rode it with a precision that turned flight into something closer to music. Each stroke was measured, controlled, the new membrane flexing but holding. He was testing himself, Aelith realized, measuring what he could do against what he remembered. She leaned forward and placed both hands flat on his neck. The scales thrummed under her palms. The harmonic filled her not from outside, but from the contact, transmitted through the skin, through the bone, through whatever connection had formed between them in a quarantine bay over 12 days of salve and water, and sitting on stone floors. This time, the harmonic carried a word she understood without translation. Home. Not a place, not a direction. The word meant this sky, this bond. This thing that was not supposed to exist, that 4,000 years of political silence had declared impossible, that every protocol and regulation and cultural norm had been designed to prevent. And that had happened anyway, because a stable hand had sat on a floor and offered a bucket of water to a creature that everyone else had written off. At the apex of a thermal, Drevok banked. The world tilted, and Aelith saw the thorn crags from above, the jagged ridgeline running north like a spine, the valley spreading below in shades of green and bronze, the station a cluster of geometry on the clifftop, impossibly small. She could see the landing platforms, the roost towers, the stable block where she had spent 3 years hauling water and shoveling feed. From up here it looked like a toy. Everything she had known looked like a toy, and the sky looked like what it was. The thing she had been born beneath but had never touched. Drevok leveled out and glided. The wing beats stopped. The thermal held them. For a span of seconds that Aelith would carry for the rest of her life, they hung in the morning air with nothing between them and the ground but trust and the thin membrane of a wing that had been torn apart and put back together by a woman with a jar of salve and no formal training. The harmonic in his chest was not a word this time. It was not a concept or a feeling. It was a sound that predated language, that came from the place where breath meets bone, and it said the only thing that mattered. We are here, and we are together, and the sky is ours. They flew for 11 minutes. Drevok brought them down on the landing platform with a gentleness that belied his size, his claws finding the basalt without a sound, his wings folding with the careful precision of something precious. Aelith slid from his back on legs that were shaking and found that she was crying, and that the crying was not from sadness or fear, but from the sudden, overwhelming recognition that the sky was real and she had been in it. Commander Doran was standing at the platform's edge. Behind her a crowd. Half the station, the remaining Dragonkin officials, the veterinary staff, a comm officer holding a relay pad with a live connection to somewhere Aelith did not want to think about. Doran looked at Aelith, looked at Drevok, looked at the tears on the stable hand's face and the round, luminous pupil of the war dragon standing behind her, his head lowered to her level, his breath stirring her hair. "Report to the briefing room," Doran said. Her voice was thick. "The Sovereignty Council is on the line. They want to know what happened." "I can tell you what happened," Aelith said. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, leaving a streak of dragon-scale dust across her cheek. "I sat with him. I treated his wounds. I didn't ask anything from him and I didn't threaten him. I just showed up every day and did the work." She looked at Drevok. "He did the rest." From the cliffs above, a sound. Not from the station, from higher, from the Thorncrag ridgeline where the wild thermals ran. A vocalization, deep and resonant, carrying across the valley with a force that rattled the landing platform's drainage grates. Then another, from the east, lower bass-heavy. Another, from the south, clear as struck bronze. Aelith looked up. On the ridgeline silhouetted against the brightening sky, 3 shapes, then 5, then 9. Sovereign dragons, perched on the basalt crags, their wings catching the morning light, their heads raised, their voices joining in a harmonic that Aelith could feel in her bones and her blood, and the place behind her sternum where Drevok's word home still resonated. The dragons on the station's roost platforms began to answer. One by one, then in groups, their voices rising to meet the chorus from the crags, until the entire valley thrummed with a sound that Aelith's species had not heard in 4,112 years. Sovereign recognition, the chorus that marked a bond. Drevok added his voice. It was the loudest, a deep, searing harmonic that cut through the others the way a river cuts through stone, not by force but by persistence. By the sheer, stubborn weight of something that had been held back for too long and was finally allowed to exist. Aelith stood on the landing platform with dragon dust on her face, and a curry brush still clipped to her belt, and listened to the oldest sound in the known galaxy welcome her into a story she had never asked to be part of. She reached up and placed her hand on Drevok's jaw. He leaned into her palm. The chorus held for 90 seconds. It ended the way it had begun, not sharply, but in a slow fade, each voice settling back into the morning quiet, until the only sound left was Drevok's harmonic, steady and warm, pressing against her hand. Veilthorn's voice came over the open comm channel that the Dragonkin officials had been too stunned to close. He had been listening from the Sovereignty's interior command. His words were formal, deliberate, and carried the cadence of something being spoken for the historical record. Let it be noted that on this day a bond of the old covenant was renewed, not by the Sovereignty's design, not by ritual, not by decree, by a human who brought water and stayed. Let it be noted that the sovereignty was wrong to forget what this looks like. The comm closed. The officials stood with their data slates lowered, their crests dipped. Commander Doran stared at the sky as though seeing it for the first time. Jell was standing at the back of the crowd. He had come up from the roost platforms when the chorus started, drawn by a sound that his 20 years of dragon handling had never prepared him for. His face was wet. He did not wipe it. When the crowd began to disperse slowly, reluctantly, the way people leave a place where something important has happened, he walked over to Aelith. He did not say anything. He handed her a fresh bag of fire-charred bone strips, the ones he had been leaving outside Quarantine 12, and squeezed her shoulder once. Then he went back to work. Aelith looked at Drevok. He looked back at her with the steady amber eye of a dragon who had been discharged, condemned, quarantined and scheduled for destruction, and who had found, in a stable hand with a bucket and a brush, the one thing that 800 years of sovereign service had never given him. Someone who showed up. "Come on," she said, scratching the ridge above his eye. "Let's get your other wing treated before it stiffens up." He followed her back into the stable. His claws clicked on the stone. The harmonic in his chest did not stop. In the briefing room, Commander Doran would spend the next 4 hours explaining to the Sovereignty Council how a stable hand with no handler certification, no veterinary degree, and no flight training had formed the first true rider bond in 4 millennia. She would struggle with the explanation, because the explanation was simple, and simplicity does not fill 4 hours. At one point, a council member, an elderly dragonkin whose scale marks designated him as a historian of the Second Covenant era, would interrupt Doran's report to ask a single question. What did the human do that was different from what the handlers did? Doran would pause for a long time before answering. "She sat on the floor," she would say. "She brought water. She came back every day. She treated his injuries with a compound she mixed herself, applied by hand without protective equipment. She talked to him about the weather and the grain shipments and a dragon she helped when she was 16 years old." Another pause. She did not try to control him. She did not try to manage him. She just stayed. The historian would nod slowly, as though the answer had confirmed something he had suspected for a very long time. "That," he would say, "is the old way, the way it was done before the separation, before we taught ourselves to be afraid of what closeness might mean." In the archives, the Dragonkin official would file her documentation under a new category that had not existed before that morning: Active Bond Records, Current Era. The file would carry one annotation, added by the archivist who processed it, who had read the full account and felt compelled to add a personal note in the margin. 4,000 years, we waited for someone worthy of the old bond. She arrived with a water pail and sat on the floor. Perhaps that was always the qualification we should have been looking for. In the stable, Aelith Sorvin worked. She applied the evening salve to Drevok's wing. She cleaned his scales with the curry brush. She refilled his water from the courtyard pump. She did these things the way she had done them every day since the morning she walked into Quarantine 12, without ceremony, without performance, without any awareness that what she was doing was remarkable. Drevok watched her with round amber eyes and a harmonic in his chest that said, in a language older than words, the simplest and most devastating thing one being can say to another. "You came, you stayed, that was enough."